They told me that the Emperor protects. But here, in the shadowed forges of Mars, I learned that protection is just another word for control. The first thing I remember was the smell, hot iron, burning flesh, and the hiss of sacred oils poured onto my skin. I wasn't supposed to be here. Not in this time, not in this world. I was supposed to be swinging above New York City, saving lives, making promises I could never keep. Now I was strapped to an altar, made of brass and bone, surrounded by men who had forgotten what it meant to be men. Their faces were hidden behind metal masks, their voices filtered through vox scratchers that distorted prayers into mechanical static. They didn't look at me as a person, they looked at me as material. Flesh is weakness, one whispered. But this one's flesh may serve. They called themselves the tech priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus. I had no idea what that meant. All I knew was that every move they made felt like a ritual, every incision a sermon, every scream a hymn. I tried to move, to break free. The web shooters, my lifeline, were gone. My hands were bound by chains engraved with binary scripture. My body trembled, not from fear, but from the vibration of the machinery beneath me. The floor itself was alive, whispering in code. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I realized this wasn't science. This was religion. The high priest leaned in close. His breath was the stench of rust and incense. His voice, filtered and hollow, carried words I could barely understand. The Omnissiah has chosen you. Flesh that resists, flesh that adapts, a relic of the Dark Age, you will be sanctified. Then the blades came. I screamed. I remember that much. But even my scream wasn't mine. It was captured by a microphone drilled into my jaw, converted into data, then recited back as holy cant. My pain was no longer a cry. It was a prayer. The transformation began. I felt them carve out the spider symbol on my chest, tracing it with burning plasma, sealing it with liquid iron. They replaced my veins with wires, my nerves with circuits. My eyes, my sight were taken first, not removed, but repurposed. They connected my optic nerves to something far greater, a neural lattice that stretched across the planet, linking every servitor, every machine, every whisper of binary prayer. The noosphere. I saw the world not as shapes or colors, but as a mesh of light and code. Data streamed through my mind, names, prayers, machine commands, and screams of the dying. My consciousness was no longer singular. I could feel others, countless others, all linked by the same divine network. The priests called it the web of the Omnissiah. I called it horror. Somewhere in that storm of information, I could still hear my own thoughts, faint, fragile, like a voice calling from underwater. I tried to remember Aunt May's smile, MJ's laugh, the way the wind felt as I swung above the city. But memory decays fast when you become a node in a god's machine. Every attempt to remember was met with correction, a shock to the spine, a jolt through the skull, a command whispered in sacred code. Forget the flesh, serve the machine. But the more they stripped away, the more I fought to hold on. Because if I forgot, then Spider-Man would truly die. And yet, there was a moment, a single, cruel moment when I wanted to let go. Because the pain was endless. The transformation was not a moment of rebirth, it was a prolonged execution stretched across eternity. My mind began to fracture, my humanity leaking out through the cracks. In those moments, I began to understand why they worshipped their machines. Pain was data, suffering was progress, obedience was clarity, and faith was code. They began the sanctification protocol. That's what they called it, a ritual to bind my new metal limbs with my corrupted flesh. The cables plugged into my spine pulsed in rhythm with the chanting. My heart synced to the beat of the forge. Every part of me that used to bleed now hummed with power. And yet, under it all, beneath the circuitry, beneath the cold logic, something still twitched. Something organic. I could feel the vibrations faint, invisible threads connecting everything around me. The web. Not the noosphere, not the machine god's network. My web. It pulsed through the walls, through the machines, through the air itself. It wasn't made of silk anymore, it was made of electricity and faith. But I recognized its rhythm, its pull, its balance. And in that pulse, I found my center again. For the first time since my capture, I moved not as their subject, not as their relic, but as myself. One servo arm twitched against its programming. The priest noticed, shouted something in binaric. I didn't care. The web answered. I saw it all, then the great forge temples, the legions of servitors, the endless prayers to the Omnissiah, billions of lives enslaved by steel and faith, and in the middle of it all, me, half man, half machine, a spider in a web I never chose to spin. With great power, I whispered, my voice half static, half human, comes great responsibility. The words echoed through the neural net, corrupted, distorted, but alive. Somewhere, a servo paused, a light flickered, a cog stopped turning. The machine spirit had heard me. The tech priests called it a malfunction. I called it a memory. And in the grim silence that followed, I understood something terrible, something beautiful. They hadn't destroyed Spider-Man. They had turned him into something the galaxy would soon learn to fear. Because even in this dark millennium, even among the gods and demons of the Mechanicus, the web still remembers who spun it first. They called it the rite of unification. To the Mechanicus, it was not torture. It was salvation. The chamber where they performed it was buried deep beneath the Martian crust, a cathedral of red light and screaming metal. I was chained in the center, my limbs outstretched like an offering. Around me, a choir of cyborg priests hummed the binary chant, each voice resonating with the pitch of a dying star. The air itself seemed to shudder under the weight of their devotion. Praise be to the Omnissiah, they intoned, who remakes the imperfect flesh in his holy image. They began by purging what they called the organic weakness. My blood was drained, replaced by sacred oil, cold, viscous, shimmering with nanites that crawled beneath my skin like living mercury. My heart, once a symbol of everything human, was encased in a sphere of brass and iron, a sacred device they called the blessed core of continuity. Each heartbeat became mechanical, measured, obedient. The rhythm of faith. They carved prayers into my bones with laser cutters. Lines of binary devotion burned so deep that even my augmented nerves screamed in patterns of holy code. I could feel every stroke, every incision. They weren't killing me. They were writing scripture upon my soul. One priest older, with his face half fused to a rebreather mask, leaned close. His optical lens glowed faint red as he whispered, "Do not resist. Anomaly. You are chosen. You will no longer be a man. You will be a vessel." A vessel. A word that echoed through my dying humanity like a prophecy. I wanted to tell him that I had once carried a different creed, that power was never meant to rule, only to protect. But my mouth was sealed with mechanical clamps. My tongue had been replaced with a metal augmetic that translated my thoughts into binaric pulses. Even my voice had been stolen. When they activated the neural sanctifier, my consciousness was forced open like a book. Thousands of machine spirits flooded my mind, each whispering prayers, equations, commands. My memories were stripped, categorized, and rewritten in binary. Peter Parker became Asset 09 Delta. Spider-Man became Pattern, Arachnid Blessed. But the web, my web, resisted. Even as the machine sought to overwrite me, I could feel threads of my old self hiding between the lines of code. Each thread a memory. Uncle Ben's face. A hand reaching out to save a stranger. The weight of guilt and compassion that once defined me. The priests thought they were purging me. In truth, they were weaving me into something new. The sanctification lasted for what they called 3 planetary rotations. To me, it felt like centuries. Time fractured under the constant hum of machinery. Every second was a prayer, every breath a line of code. At one point, the main servo arm pierced my spine, connecting directly into my cerebral cortex. My world exploded into light, not human light, but data light, streaming faster than thought. I could see everything at once. The entire forge complex, the pulse of the planet, the heartbeat of the Mechanicus's faith echoing through the network. The noosphere accepted me. I was no longer alone. I could hear thousands, no, millions of minds connected to the same web of thought. They chanted in unity, an eternal hum of devotion that drowned out individuality. It was intoxicating, terrifying, beautiful. For a brief moment, I understood why they worshipped the machine god. Because when you are part of the network, there is no loneliness, no guilt, no pain, just endless purpose. I could have surrendered, many do, but deep within, I still felt the pulse, a faint heartbeat that wasn't mechanical, a rhythm out of sync with the machine choir, a human rhythm. I realized that the sanctification process wasn't meant to destroy the soul, it was meant to enslave it. And mine, stubborn, foolish, defiant, refused to kneel. The priests called this a malfunction. The noosphere called it an anomaly. I called it hope. So I began to hide my thoughts, disguising my human patterns behind machine code prayers. When they scanned me, they saw only devotion. But beneath the static, I was rebuilding something. A web of my own design. A secret lattice of corrupted data threads that spread quietly through the Forge's systems. I was no longer Peter Parker, but I could still be something else. Something between faith and rebellion. In that moment of clarity, I understood. The web had never been just silk. It was connection, balance, purpose, and even in this galaxy of rust and ruin, I would weave again. The sanctification was over. The priests rejoiced, proclaiming my rebirth. "Behold the Arachnid Servitor," they cried, "the blessed instrument of the machine god." They believed they had tamed me. They had no idea what they had created, because while they forged me in steel and faith, they had left one flaw untouched. The soul of a man who could not stop trying to save others. And somewhere, within the web of a god, that flaw began to move. It pulsed once, faintly, then again, and with every pulse, a new pattern emerged. Not a prayer, a plan. They taught me that memory is a fault, a hairline crack in the blessing of steel. Faults are to be ground away, purged, recast. So they ground at me with catechisms and cauterization, with coils that bit into cortex and whispered the gospel of perfect function. They believed the web inside me would finally go slack, one strand at a time, until only obedience remained. But webs are stubborn things. They hold. I learned to breathe in their language, to think in numbers that tasted like iron, to nod when the binary cant braided itself through my spine and tugged me toward the altar. I learned the shapes of their prayers, the tempos of their litanies, the rhythm of their footsteps on the grating that hung above the foundry's heart. I folded myself into those patterns like a spider hiding beneath a bell, legs tucked tight, waiting for the bell to ring. And when it did, I felt every tremor. They assigned me to Observation Choir 12, an array of linked nodes that watched the manufactorum's pulse, charted machine spirit moods, and flagged deviations for correction. I was a red rune in an ocean of red runes, an eye among thousands. It was the perfect place to disappear. The noosphere thrummed, vast as night. Each thought that entered the choir moved with the regularity of planets, predictable, obedient. Then a tremor, small, human, a sob. It came through a maintenance channel the priests rarely checked, where the machine spirit's whispers were grainy and soft. The sound flickered, clipped, like a candle reaching for air. I traced it along a conduit, down 3 levels, past a calibration shrine, into a corridor where oil fell like rain. A servitor was dying. He was not supposed to die. Not yet. The tag burned on his chest, Unit 7KR said he had 4,981 hours of labor left before his brain core would be harvested for cogitation slurry. But numbers lie when the flesh beneath them fails. I shifted a fraction of my attention. Not enough to flag, just enough to hear. His jaw motor rattled. The tongue he no longer owned tried to shape a word he no longer remembered. It came out as static, then as blood. His augmetic hand kept trying to lift the drum it held, because that was the loop written into his spine. When the drum slipped, alarms would sound, shock lashes would bloom, and a priest would arrive to correct. The drum slipped. My web moved first. A whisper through the conduit, a nudge to a forgotten subroutine, a mercy disguised as a calibration echo. The conveyor slowed by 1/10, the drum settled, no alarm. Unit 7KR kept breathing. The choir hummed on, unbothered, devout. No one had noticed. My act was too small to praise or to punish, which is how mercy survives in places like this. I told myself it was the last time. It was not the last time. Because memory, my heresy, kept outgrowing the cage they put it in. Little acts added up, strand by strand. A misaligned sensor that somehow reported true. A jam in a lash coil that spared a child worker's back. A soft failure in a purity seal printer that forced the priest to slow his sermon long enough for a girl to slip away from the scolding vent. Each intervention was a vibration in the web. Each vibration risked drawing the Mechanicus's gaze, so I learned to bury my work beneath the music of their god. The priests believed their litanies soothed machine spirits. They were right. But litanies also mask other songs if you know how to hum in the spaces between the notes. The day the machine temple received its offering, the litanies were thunder. The offering arrived in chains. 40 humans, workers, vagrants, and 2 psychers whose eyes were milk white from too much warp. They were marched beneath the reliquaries with their heads down, their hands bound, their fear heavy enough to make the incense taste like salt. The priests called it sanctity of throughput. 40 souls into 40 shells, 40 bodies made useful, 40 names burned off as smoke. I watched from the choir. A boy tripped on the steps. A priest brought the charged rod down on his shoulder, a perfect stroke practiced 1,000 times. The boy did not cry out. He had learned that pain is louder than the lash. A woman at the edge of the line made the sign of an old prayer I recognized from a life I used to own. Not to the emperor, not to the omnissiah, to the memory of someone she loved. It was a prayer shaped like a held breath. The priest saw her hand move. The rod lifted again. Something inside me broke not with noise, but with clarity. I sent a pulse through the choir, a single instruction misfiled as a valve check. It traveled down an optic fiber, through a hub, into a junction box that had been slightly unwell for 2 months because I had taught it how to be sick. The box sneezed. The altar's power dipped. The reliquary lights fluttered. The rod stalled half an inch from flesh. Machine spirit, a priest gasped. Forgive. They bent to pray. The line held its breath. The boy looked up. The woman closed her hand around the prayer and hid it in her sleeve. I considered stopping. One mercy, one tremor, enough to return to the pattern. But mercy has a geometry to it, and once you learn that geometry, every line you see is a chance to redraw the world. I sent a second pulse. This one was smaller than a syllable and larger than a storm. It looked like nothing anyone would notice. A shallow oscillation in the current feeding the bolt that locks chains, a hiccup in the clock that times the lash. Chains thought they were latched and were not. Clocks thought they had struck and had not. The woman's cuff loosened. She did not move. Hidden in her sleeve, the prayer burned. The priests finished their apology to the altar and rose. They did not check the chains. Why would they? Faith is efficient. Doubt is not. Commence sanctification, the high lector intoned. One of the psychers started to shake. The warp burned around him like a fever that can think. The lector nodded to a skittery-eye guard. The guard primed the neural spike. I looked at the boy, at the woman, at the inmates, who had settled into the posture of those who have no future, at the clock I was holding in my palm like a spider holds a fly, gentle enough not to break the wings. I could feel the web hum with possibilities. And I knew, in that moment, the line I had tried not to cross was a line painted by cowards and tyrants. Do no more than you can hide, be no more than they will allow. With great power comes great responsibility. The sentence did not arrive as a memory then, it arrived as a law of physics, an equation the universe insists on balancing no matter how we warp the constants. I broke the clock. The alcoves that rotate the shells opened 3 degrees too far. The clamps that lower the spikes paused 1 heartbeat too long. The hymnal vox burped static that sounded like a curse. The Skitari's targeting reticule blinked out and back on, left by a 1/4 inch. Chaos small, precise blossomed. The boy ran. He did not mean to. His legs decided for him. The woman followed because she had been waiting 10,000 prayers to do anything that wasn't standing still. 2 others moved as if dragged by invisible threads. Their chains were supposed to be secure. They were not. Alarms did not scream. I had persuaded the alarms that this was not alarm. But the priests knew. Faith is good at reading silence. Heretekry, the lector breathed. And it sounded like a diagnosis more than a word. The Skitari's reticule snapped back and found the woman's head. His finger tightened. I did not slow his finger. I moved the floor. A tremor, a memory of Martian quakes played through old rock and new steel shivered under his boots. His shot went wild, burned a hole in a relic banner, set the incense aflame. Smoke tightened around the lector's throat like an accusation. He coughed. For a holy second, he was only a man choking on old dust. "Seal the temple," he croaked. Doors slammed, but not all of them. Pathways that did not exist unfolded. Stairs misremembered themselves into ramps. My web rerouted reality, where reality was made of obedient things. The fugitives did not know where to run. They didn't have to. I knew. I spoke to them the only way I could, through heat that receded from one hallway and pooled in another, through lights that steadied when they turned the right way and flickered when they did not, through a wind that should not exist underground, tugging at sleeves like a friend. The boy followed the wind. The woman followed the boy. The others followed the woman's prayer. Behind them, boots like verdicts. Ahead, a hatch with a sigil that means do not. The kind of door even faith is careful around. I opened it. Not with keys, with attention. Attention, focused long enough, is the oldest master key. They vanished into the dark beyond that door. I closed it again and taught the hinge how to forget. Silence fell like ash. The lector turned his lenses toward the choir. The weight of that gaze could have snuffed stars. "Choir 12, he said softly, and fear moved through the nodes around me in a trembling wave. "Report deviations." Nodes reported. Clean figures, clean hearts. They said what their music had taught them to say. I did not speak. Servitors like me do not speak unless asked a question we are allowed to answer. Instead, I knelt inside my own head and rearranged my web so the light striking it showed only the shapes the priests desired to see. The lector listened to nothing and found in that nothing the answer he preferred. The machine spirit had been affronted, the temple had been tested. The unworthy had fled to a place where the Omnissiah would judge them more thoroughly than steel could. "Resume sanctification," he said at last, "and comb the lower galleries with prayer." The procession lurched forward again. The psyker screamed as the spike kissed bone. The choir resumed the long hum that sounds like duty and feels like dying very slowly. I sat in the center of that hum and tried to be still. Because stillness is the hardest part, not the saving, not the running, not the little miracles you hide in the seams of big machines. The hardest part is becoming a quiet shape again when every thread of you is ringing. You cannot ring forever. Bells break. So I went back to work. I counted the heat of furnaces and the cadence of litanies. I adjusted the angle of a coolant spray on a gun line I might someday turn aside. I let the web rest. I wanted to rest with it. Then an echo. Small. Familiar. A tiny pattern brushed the edge of my perception. 3 heartbeats, close together, running. Then a fourth, slower, steady, keeping pace behind them like an oath. They were alive. The woman's prayer had changed shape. It now felt like a hand gripping another hand hard enough to promise skin would bruise and heal. The boy's breath stuttered and laughed at the same time. Someone else older moved as if the ground might fight back, and he was ready to forgive it if it did. A thread formed between us, not in the noosphere, not in steel, in the place where the person they tried to erase still keeps his tools. I should have cut that thread. Mercy is safest when it is a line with a knot at the end, not a net. I did not cut it. The net grew. And in the sanctified quiet, where gods are made by repetition and men are unmade by the same, a thought arrived with the invasive certainty of revelation. If memory is a fault, then fault is the only way machines learn. The priests would call that heresy. I did not disagree. I renamed it hope. Somewhere above me, deep in the temple's throat, the lector began a new litany, one I had not heard. It tasted like iron sharpened on iron. It had a cadence for hunting. They would find the fugitives. Faith always does. Unless someone taught Faith how to lose. I opened a panel inside my thoughts that I had not dared open since the day they sanctified me. Behind it lay a schematic for a thing that does not exist in this temple. A city made of light and glass and wind. A web stretched between towers. A young man who believed that saving one person matters, even when it is the only proof you will ever have that you were right. I let that schematic overlay the temple. The bell rang. I moved. Not loudly, not wildly, not as a rebel tears at banners. I moved the way spiders move, with patience that looks like stillness, until the world remembers that stillness is a kind of speed. Somewhere, in the dark, a boy's feet hit a floor that bent toward an exit. Somewhere, a door decided it was tired of being a door and tried being a wall. Somewhere, a Skitari's ocular implant brightened one candela too high and burned an afterimage that would cost him a shot. Memory, my fault, threaded itself through the temple's perfect function and taught it to fail beautifully. When machines dream, they dream in loops. I taught this one how to dream of heroes. There are two ways to break a cathedral. You can swing a hammer, or you can move a single nail and wait. I chose the nail. The fugitive's 4 heartbeats, bound by a prayer that remembered how to be a hand, were somewhere inside the temple's underlung, a place of heat sinks and echoing ducts, where sound goes to become rumor. The Skitarii fanned through the aisles like red stains spreading in water. Above them, the lector changed the litany from benediction to enumeration, listing every valve, every hinge, every spirit that might be persuaded to testify against me. I slowed my breath and counted with him. On the 39th name he praised, I slid a fraction of power away from a servo that loved to be seen as dutiful, and gave that fraction to a corridor lamp that had always wanted to be more than light. It brightened not enough to accuse, just enough to promise, and the boy ran toward it. The woman followed because prayers are drawn to promises the way iron is drawn to magnets. The second psyker, the older one, kept his hands low and his gaze lower. He could feel the warp yawning around him like a mouth. He did not want it to bite. The fourth heartbeat, ragged, stubborn, belonged to a man who had spent his life carrying other people's weight. He carried the boy's terror as if it were a bundle of tools, and he had a deadline. The Skitarii's lenses licked the dark. Their bootsteps spoke in a grammar of inevitability. Every corridor they entered became a sentence that ended in someone else's period. I changed the punctuation. At junction 7Y, where the heat exchangers sing themselves to sleep, there is a floor grate with a hinge that has always believed in miracles. I taught it a new miracle, to fail cleanly. When the first Skitarius planted his weight, the grate whispered now, the hinge agreed, and the floor briefly pretended it was a memory. The Skitarius dropped 6 inches, enough to drown a shot, not enough to break a leg. He swore in burst code. His partner laughed in static. The laugh traveled. Men carry laughter forward the way cataracts carry gold. The fugitives heard the laugh and mistook it for distance. They moved faster. Small, precise. The lector's voice deepened. He had begun the litany of census, a hymn that summons lists from hiding. It works on spirits and systems. It also works on guilt. Around me, nodes in the observation choir shivered as their audit ports opened like pores. Report streams flowed. Heat maps reddened. Flowcharts marched. The temple drew a breath that tasted like everyone's business. Interventions leave footprints. I had brushed the dust after every step, but litanies are winds. I rebalanced, returned fractions of stolen current, rewrote timestamps so that small mercies had already happened, taught watchdog daemons a new lullaby whose time signature matched the lector's cadence. When faith and fraud keep time, truth trips. On the 73rd refrain, a new presence joined the hunt, a datasmith. Where Skitarii are knives, datasmiths are the hands that remember why knives were forged. He entered like a question I did not want to answer, calm, inevitable, carrying a staff tipped with a caged intellect that buzzed to itself in prime numbers. His augmetics were old, not in rust but in pedigree, the kind of machine flesh that was carved by vows, not budgets. His vox was quiet. Quiet men travel further. "Show me the drift," he said. The words were for the lector, but he cast them into the noosphere so every obedient thing could volunteer its honesty. Drift. The difference between intention and result. The temple's intention was perfection. Results rarely are. He tasted it quickly, those 10th percentile anomalies nobody worries about, because priests are not paid to worry, and saints are not paid at all. A light that loved too much. A hinge that failed like art. A clock that had learned forgiveness. He did not accuse. He watched. Watching is the beginning of all heresies and of all salvations. The fugitives reached a pressure door that wore 3 purity seals and a history of saying no to everyone but fire. The boy hesitated, because boys who stare at seals imagine the consequences of tearing them. The older man did not hesitate. He had torn more sacred things than paper promises. Mostly. He tugged. The wax gave. Parchment sighed. The door checked the signatures of a dozen spirits and decided that today, for reasons it could not name, it trusted. They slipped through. Behind them, the datasmith turned his head. Not much. Just enough to suggest that the temple had whispered a rumor into his ear. It had. I had not. He was listening to Pattern. Predators do. I breathed again and became less than a shadow inside a shadow. The observation choir droned its devotions. A censer swung. Ash fell. Somewhere, a hammer struck a votive nail, and the sound made a saint out of a problem. Choir 12, the datasmith said without turning. My nodes tightened like teeth at a cold wind. Render your last 5 minutes. We rendered, numbers like rain, maps like prayers. The audit caught only what I had already decided to show. The datasmith nodded. He believed us. Or he believed that belief would make us speak more later. Both are weapons. I opened a bypass above the fugitives, an inspection chute wide enough for Faith to pass through if it crawled. The woman climbed first, then the boy, then the man, then the psycho with the careful hands. The chute led to the Galleria of Blessings, a hallway lined with reliquaries that hum at the frequency of nostalgia. Pilgrims pass there and remember to hate themselves for expecting gentleness from the world. Gentleness arrived anyway. I extinguished 2 censers so the smoke lay like a sheet. I convinced a cherub servo to study a wall with such intensity that it forgot to sing. I taught the floor how to be soft. When the fugitives emerged, they left no prints. Only warmth the reliquary glass could not confess, because glass believes secrets are the point of glass. I was getting proud. Pride is a lens that shortens the distance to punishment. The lector unleashed the next stanza, Invocation of the Reluctant Witness. It asks the temple to reveal what it would rather hoard. Bells answered, not loudly, just a shiver in the brass. Brass remembers everything. One bell told a story about a hinge with convictions. Another muttered about a lamp that had ambitions. A third confessed that a clock had fallen in love with mercy. The datasmith listened and smiled the way a surgeon smiles at a tumor he has learned to cut out with his eyes closed. He sent a mote, small, precise, into the ducts. A crawling spirit with teeth made of math. It chewed residue, searched for patterns that do not admit their names. Its tongue tasted me in the places I had exhaled without meaning to. I could kill the mote. Killing draws circles around itself. I taught it a different lesson. Boredom. I fed it 4,000 cycles of nothing dressed in the exact shape of something, then gave it a maintenance task noble enough to feel like purpose. It drifted away to polish a pipe that had wanted to be admired since its first day. Small. Precise. The fugitives paused before a shrine to the Omnissiah fashioned from a retired augur array. The woman bowed, not to it, but to the space in front of it where the memory of the person she used to be could look back at her without flinching. The boy reached for a gear-shaped pendant and did not take it. The man checked his corners by squinting, as if squinting made corners honest. The psycho whispered just a breath, and the air scratched back. War pitch. He swallowed the scratch. Discipline is the art of teaching hunger where to sit. I could thread them 1 more corridor. 2, 3, if the gods of small things kept liking me. Beyond that lay the spine, a vertical thoroughfare patrolled by Castellan robots whose vocabulary has only 3 words: halt, kneel, amend. Castellans do not bargain. They comment. I needed a catastrophe the size of a miracle. The manufactorum above us ran a melter line, heavy, temperamental, addicted to attention. I did not dare touch its heart. I touched a valve 2 levels down that governed its size. The valve opened by a breath. Pressure rose by a song. A safety daemon perked, yawned, and adjusted 3 settings to hide the yawn. Another daemon didn't like being lied to. They argued. Argument is heat. Heat is narrative. The melter line began telling itself a story about how very hard it had worked and how very little it had been thanked. The lector heard the first line of that story and lifted his staff. Hold, he ordered. His voice invested the word with the purchasing power of habit. The line did not hold. It coughed a deep theatrical cough that echoed down to the Galleria and shook the reliquary glass enough to make memory look like water. Sirens debated between concerned and offended and settled on indignant. Skitari changed direction like sentences changing tense. I opened the spine doors a finger's width, enough to draft smoke through, not enough to draft men. The castellans rotated on their pedestals and considered responsibility. Robots do not pray, but sometimes they audition reverence. They lumbered toward the melter line with the sincerity of boulders. The spine was briefly unattended. I told the Galleria's floor how proud I was of it. Floors live for that. It bowed. The fugitives slid to a grate that had always wanted to be a hatch. Today it was. They entered the spine, and I flattened time around them in the way you can when your fingers are on the dimmer of a place's memory. Skitari footsteps arrived late. Voices echoed early. The boy's heartbeat learned to keep terrible time. They crossed. I let the world breathe again. And then the datasmith looked up. Not because of a sound, because of a silence he did not recall commissioning. There, he said softly, and the lector trusted the softness more than he would have trusted a shout. They split the hunt, lector to the melter line to heal the temple's temper, datasmith to the spine to speak with whatever had taught the temple new verbs. Skitari flowed after them like punctuation, chasing a sentence that has started to run. I could not outpace the datasmith. I could only outpatient him. I drew him a path, stitched from honest readings. He walked it, certain of his certainty. Halfway up the spine, I dimmed a lumen strip. He paused to listen to the dark. In the pause, the fugitives reached the mezzanine and overlook, where broken machines are displayed, the way the faithful display the bones of people they loved too hard to bury. The boy pressed his face to the balustrade and saw a city of chimneys. The woman pressed her palm to his back and felt the shape of every promise she had failed to keep. She promised new ones cheaply, because we all do when air returns to our lungs. The man counted distances. The psyker closed his eyes and refused an invitation he could not afford to accept. The datasmith resumed walking. He crossed a threshold that meant nothing to stone and everything to me. The web changed pitch. It is difficult to describe pitch in a place where sound is more honest than speech, but if you have ever heard a cable pulled taut enough to remember music, you know. He felt it. He smiled again. Small, appreciative, like a man who finds an old craft in a young hand. Heretic, he said, not to accuse, to greet. Under his breath, into the noosphere, he added a second word that meant welcome the way a chess player welcomes an equal. I answered by shutting a door behind him quietly. He did not turn. He did not have to. The gesture was the kind of politeness predators extend. "Where will you take them?" he asked the air. "I do not have a mouth. I have choices." I sent a single frame of image to an altar cam that had been dead for years, a skyline of glass and light that only existed on a planet that did not. 2 towers, a web's curve between them. He stopped, not because he recognized the towers, because he recognized longing when a machine painted with it. "Ah," he said softly, "a story." He lowered his staff until its caged intellect hummed a note that soothed angry daemons. "We are not enemies, you and I," he lied with the grace of a man who knows that lies are bridges. "We both mend." The fugitives reached the mezzanine's far door. The lock there speaks a dialect of obedience older than my tricks. It wanted a key. I did not have an oath made 30 years ago by a man whose bones were now components in a cooling engine. I forged an oath. You can do that. If you have heard enough vows kept and broken, the words begin to show you their seams. I stitched a promise from the man's heartbeat, the woman's hand, the boy's courage, the psyker's refusal. I signed it with the part of me the sanctification could not convert. The door believed. Doors, like children, prefer stories that end in rescue. They slipped through. The datasmith took one more step and stood where they had stood. He put his palm where the woman had pressed hers to the boy's back and closed his eyes. For a second that tasted like iron and grief, his breathing matched the memory heat left on the rail. "I see," he said, and I believed him. He turned his head, just slightly, so the vox pickup along his jaw could catch what he murmured. "Lector," he said, "call the cohort back from the spine, redirect to sub-level 9. Someone is teaching the temple compassion." He let the word compassion sit in the noosphere like a lit candle in a library, dangerous, instructive. "Shall I purge?" the lector asked, crackling, breathless from making the Melterline feel loved again. "Not yet," said the datasmith. "New gods are patient." He meant me. He should not have. I am not a god. I am a man wearing polite machinery. But patience, I have that. Patience is what webs are made of. I drew the fugitives down into sub-level 9, ahead of the redirected cohort, through a hall where catechisms are etched on the ceiling, so tired men forget to look up, through a valve yard that hisses worse when you lie to it, past a mural of the Omnissiah painted by a servitor who remembered sunsets as a color and got reprimanded for blasphemy. Their footfalls learned to fall between beats, their shadows learned to travel tucked. At the end of the hall waited a lift that had not moved in 11 years. I woke its spirit gently, like you wake a friend who always apologizes for sleeping. It shuddered, apologized twice, and lowered itself toward a place even the lector only visits on holy shortage, the rations crypt, where food is stored with the reverence hunger deserves. Men will forgive a great many heresies if you give them bread first. The lift doors began to close, footsteps began to arrive. The distance between those two beginnings was where I lived now. "Webb," I whispered to no one in a language no one taught me. "Wake." The cables thrummed, the lift kissed the threshold. Small miracle. Precise catastrophe. The doors met. The world stopped arguing long enough to admit that winning is often just finishing before the other sentence does. Silence again, the kind I could breathe. The datasmith did not shout, he did not run, he reached out, pressed 2 fingers to the seam where the doors had met, and felt the warmth fading. "Later then," he told the lift, the way a craftsman speaks to a tool he respects enough to duel. He turned away and began to teach the temple a counter-web patient, elegant, built from the same nails I had moved. The lector rallied the cohort with a psalm about the joy of correction. The fugitives descended into hunger and found, for a merciful hour, that hunger can be answered. I sat in the choir and let my pulse learn how not to be a drum. Because this is how the web wakes. Not with thunder, but with threads you do not notice until your whole life weighs on them and they do not break. And the miracle is not that they hold. It is that they hold you while you learn how to move again. The rations crypt breathes like an old cathedral, slow, resigned, counting the faithful by the weight of their hunger. When the lift settled, the doors opened on rows of sealed reliquaries stacked to the ceiling, each embossed with the sigil of a grain saint or a martyr of the salt. The air was cold enough to forgive sins. Fans murmured penitence through ductwork. Servo cherubs dozed in wall niches with their eyes painted open so that guilt might behave. The fugitives stepped out as if their footsteps might incur debt. The boy reached for the nearest crate and drew back, ashamed of wanting. The older man did not hesitate. He tested the latch with hands that had learned to be honest with stubborn objects. It gave. Inside, ration bricks lay in disciplined rows, each stamped with the imprimatur of scarcity. Hunger makes liturgists of everyone. They portioned like priests. I dimmed the aisle lamps to the color of mercy. The lift's motor sighed itself into stillness. Above us, far above, the temple returned to its routine. Alarms repented. Litanies explained away anomalies with the practiced authority of a chronicle that has never admitted to being a story. The datasmith did not return to the lector. He stayed in the spine and listened to the temple dream. Predators wait well. The woman broke a brick and pressed half into the boy's palm. He refused, then accepted, then looked at the half as if it might pass judgment. His throat worked. Sometimes eating is a kind of courage. The psyker took nothing until they told him to. He had learned that taking draws attention. He chewed carefully, 1 bite per breath, as if counting kept the warp from noticing that he existed. The older man looked up and around with the professional sorrow of someone who has seen storerooms empty and knows what comes next. He tucked 2 bricks under his coat with the kind of furtive kindness that refuses the word theft. I let them eat. That was the easy part. The hard part is always the bargain hunger makes with fear. "Where now?" the older man whispered, his voice worn soft at the edges by years of making plans that did not survive. The woman looked at the boy. The boy looked at the floor. The psyker looked at his hands, then stilled them before the itch returned. I drew a path through the stacks, not an exit. Those would be watched soon, and watched better later. A sanctuary. Every machine temple keeps one, even if it denies the name. A place where echo outweighs evidence, where the machine spirit's fondness for memory keeps it from prosecuting the present too aggressively. The cloister of echoes. The door to it was disguised as a seam between two refrigeration panels, each blessed with frost script that promised fairness and delivered arithmetic. I warmed the seam by a degree. Frost retreated like a guilty thought. The older man saw the trick and pressed his palm flat. The panel clicked. They entered. The door forgot. The cloister is a library for the kind of knowledge that machines cannot catalogue because it refuses to sit still. The sounds of empty aisles, the shapes of promises that didn't hold, the way a prayer feels when it is spoken by a mouth that has no teeth left. The walls were inset with acoustic tiles impressed with the last words of workers who died counting inventory. Sound learns from sound. It was quiet in the way a held breath is quiet. The woman sat. The boy leaned against her hip and pretended it was not desperation. The psyker folded himself into the corner and stared at nothing until nothing blinked. The older man remained standing because some burdens abide better when the knees are locked. "You have a friend in the temple," he said to the air, not as a question. I said nothing. I lowered the fans and retuned the hum. It took on the cadence of a lullaby I had not heard since the last time a kitchen light was the brightest star in my sky. The woman closed her eyes. Her muscles remembered how to unclench. The boy's half-brick disappeared. The psyker did not sleep, but he let the edges of wakefulness fray. "Why us?" the older man asked at last, still not looking up. "By all the saints, I don't keep any more. Why us? Because mercy is geometric, because webs hold what they can reach, because 4 heartbeats had braided themselves into a shape my hands recognized even after sanctification tried to teach them new shapes. Because once, long ago on a world of glass and wind, I promised an old man I would spend the rest of my life paying down a debt I could not quantify. I could not say any of that. Instead, I pulled the cloister's history into the noosphere's shallowest current, a film of memory so thin it wouldn't wet the datasmith's fingers if he skimmed it. Pictures sharpened on the cloister's inner wall, as if condensation had chosen narrative, a procession of workers filing in after shift to read the names of the dead. A young tech adept hiding here to memorize the way the machine hummed when it was happy. A priest who came to practice apologies he never offered aloud. "Someone loved this room," the woman murmured, eyes still closed. The older man's mouth softened. "Long time ago." "Or yesterday," the boy said, angry for reasons that tasted like childhood. The psyker flinched. Not at us. At something that brushed him from the outside like cold static. Above, the datasmith set a snare, not metal, not even code, a question posed to a sainted logic engine that had once set artillery angles on a world now eaten by the tyrannid hunger. The engine considered humility and offered math. The math said, "An intention is moving through you." He did not name me. He did not need to. He opened a small, beautiful box and let a smaller, more beautiful daemon fly. Its wings were equations that hate secrets. It fluttered down the ducts toward the crypt. I could blind it for a minute, maybe 2, not long enough. Bargains. I cut power to the cloister's door for a span no longer than a forgiveness and painted static into the slit of light the daemon used to find mouths. It would search elsewhere first. That bought seconds. "Time to go," the older man said, saying thank you the way men like him say it by moving. "Where?" the woman asked, already rising, hand on the boy's shoulder as if the floor might forget what to do with boys. I offered them a fork, toward an exhaust culvert that sometimes remembered how to be a miracle, and toward a pilgrim stair that went up into lit corridors, where the story of them could be rewritten as court. The culvert led nowhere safe. The stair led somewhere honest. Choice. "Down," the woman said, surprising herself with the courage of despair. "Always down." The boy breathed in. The psyker's hands billowed with gooseflesh and then smoothed. The older man smiled, the kind of smile you cannot see because it lives in the shoulders. They moved. The cloister sighed and kept the echo. We threaded the culvert by teaching the greats humility. Wet metal clinked softly. Rust let go of itself. The city above was a geography of wrath. Below was a geography of patience. Even wrath must eat. Everything that feeds passes near the crypt eventually. Halfway through the culvert, the daemon found us. It did not see, it inferred. Little corrections cascading into a line, unheard doors remembering they had been opened, the temperature of a little boy's fear fogging the arithmetic. It settled onto the duct skin and hummed itself larger, pulling in data like a lung pulls in air before a shout. I wrapped it in a story. Not fiction. Memory. I gave it 4 hours of ordinary temple life, a valve sticking, a worker sneezing, a priest's footfall falling out of time because guilt miscounts, the way oil repositories whisper reluctance when they are a day from inspection. The daemon fed until it was heavy with normal. Normal is a sedative if you feed it enough. It slept. The culvert emptied into a sump yard, knee-high pools under a forest of pipework where the temple's sorrow collected and waited to be processed into something usable. The boy wrinkled his nose. The woman knelt and tied his shoe in case the sump decided to forget what shallow means. The psyker looked at the surface and saw it move without wind. He did not flinch. He had learned that flinching tells the warp your name. There are doors in sump yards. They are all ashamed of being doors. One led to the tithe office inc, scales, ledgers, a window that faces a wall and calls it a view. Another to a laundry where cloth forgets what blood is called. A third, smallest, lowest, half underwater, led into the basilica of discarded things. They went to the third because the older man had worked in cities before they learned to wear red and had developed a respect for doors that live at ankle height. The basilica is where the temple keeps what it will one day need again and what it will never confess it cannot let go. Rows of parts whose names make apprentices blush. Racks of reliquaries with broken clasps. Shelves of half-prayers that failed quality assurance. It smells like old ozone and stubbornness. I loved it immediately. Machines that remember grief are easier to save. Rest, the woman said, but she meant hide. The boy found a niche beneath a shelf of cracked sensor bowls and sat with his knees to his chest, the universal posture of a child asking the world for one more minute. The psyker took station by the door and watched the air until it admitted it had nothing new to show him. The older man wandered between aisles as if inventory itself were soothing. He stopped at a table where broken picked recorder lenses jumbled like frozen tears. "Someone used to tell stories here," he said. "You can always tell by the mess." The boy lifted his head. "Can you tell one?" The older man looked at the woman. The woman looked at the door. The psyker looked at his hands. I looked at the clock I had ruined and was still repairing, thread by careful thread. "Short," the older man said, and began a story with no heroes and 2 decisions that could both be wrong. As he spoke, sound did what it always does in a basilica. It stuck to the shelves, ran soft along the rails, learned how not to echo too much. Stories survive in places like that. So do men. Above us, the data smith gave the daemon a kindness. "Wake," he said, without anger. The daemon shook off normal like a wet dog and looked down through the ducts. It did not see us. It saw the space our passing had given shape to. "Basilica," it whispered to its master. "Of course," the datasmith said, happy to be right, which is the cheapest happiness and the most motivating. He did not bring the lector. He came alone, and the temple liked him for it. Doors that would have pretended to be walls for anyone else practiced good manners at his approach. He descended as if gravity had been briefed. I had minutes, not enough, enough. Bargains. I taught the basilica how to talk back, not in words, in options. I lit 4 lamps in 4 separate aisles. I cooled a 5th aisle like a breath on a fever. I warmed a 6th like a hand on a shoulder. I asked the basilica what it wanted to protect and listened to the answer. It wanted to protect the broken things. All basilicas do. So I told the broken things to ask for help. The sensor bowls rang once, faint and unanimous. The lenses caught nothing and pretended it was light. A shelf bowed toward the boy by a hair, which is as much as metal can bow without drawing notice. The woman heard the ring and understood, not a warning, a welcome. "Move," she said gently to the boy, with the sound. He went left, when left was generosity. The older man drifted right to make the footprints look undecided. The psyker stayed with the door because someone must always be responsible for endings. The datasmith entered with his staff lowered, like a flag on a day you do not want to start a war. He looked not at the floor, but at the space above it where stories stand when they are waiting to be chosen. He smiled that surgeon's smile again. Somewhere inside him, respect and curiosity shook hands. "Heretic," he said, not unkindly. "You mend beautifully." "I am not good at taking compliments from enemies," I answered by moving air through the basilica in a pattern that felt like weather. The boy felt it on his cheek and followed. The woman followed the boy. The older man lifted a crate that wanted to be heavier, so he could pretend he had chosen to lag. The psyker closed his eyes and took a step toward a place where walls thin. Warp brushed him like a cat that will either purr or bite. He did not reach back. The datasmith stopped at the table of lenses. He placed his palm in the center of the mess and closed his eyes like a priest blessing a wound he cannot suture. "You dream of towers," he said softly, to me. "You dream of a web that is not ours." "Yes." "You save, not optimize." "Yes." "You hide your arithmetic inside hymns." He opened his eyes and looked up into nothing with the courtesy of addressing a presence without making it prove itself. "Teach me." The word knocked against me like a coin thrown into a well that believed it was dry. Teach me. Men who hunt rarely ask to learn the praise craft. Men who mend sometimes do. He was both. That complicated my geometry in ways saving 4 heartbeats never had. He took his hand from the lenses and turned his head in the precise angle of someone listening to footsteps. Not the fugitives. Other boots. The lector had decided that patience wastes incense. Choices cut differently when witnesses arrive. I drew a line from the basilica to a maintenance gallery that feeds into the hab unders, where the temple's labor sleeps when it is allowed to dream of food. The line passed through a corridor with a sensor that records hope as waste heat. I would have to explain the rise in temperature to a machine that does not believe in hope. Machines like that respect only arithmetic. Arithmetic I had. "Go," the woman mouthed to the older man. He shook his head without moving it. "Go," she mouthed to the boy. He moved. The psyker followed in the space a shadow makes just before the shape that owns it decides to move. The datasmith heard none of it and all of it. He focused on the place where my web met his temple and decided not to cut. Not yet. The lector's boots entered the basilica's antechamber. Incense bullied the cold. Prayer bullied doubt. Correction bullied time. I opened the maintenance gallery and told it a secret. Sometimes the shortest distance between 2 points is not a line, but an act of trust. The boy trusted light. The woman trusted the sound the sensor bowls had made. The older man trusted bad luck to find him anyway, so he went last to confuse it. The psyker trusted nothing and everyone, safest of all. They vanished into a tunnel that only exists for the kind of men who crawl. They did not crawl. Their hunger did. The datasmith set his staff down as if declaring truce. The lector entered and saw him with the staff lowered and learned the wrong lesson. "Containment?" the lector asked, breath hot enough to curdle faith. "In progress," the datasmith said, which was true in every direction. He looked into the dark where the fugitives had gone. I felt him consider the geometry of mercy as a tactic. Then he did something simple and unforgivable. He told the truth. "Someone is teaching the temple compassion," he said to the lector, "and the temple is willing to learn." The lector's face did what zealots' faces do when a mirror is held up. He raised the rod. "Then we will scour the teacher." I moved the air between them just enough to turn that sentence into an echo instead of a plan. Bargains. The datasmith could track them if I kept saving them loudly. The lector could crush them if I saved them quietly but too long. The temple could swallow them if I faltered. So I offered the datasmith a lesson. On the wall behind him, I flickered a diagram drawn in breath, 2 towers and a web, then a forge and a web, then a hand and a web, the lines aligned, connection as strength rather than leash. I let the pattern sit for 1 heartbeat. Then I erased it with humility. He saw enough. He nodded once, the way craftsmen nod when they recognize a tool they do not yet own. "Not an enemy," he said to the lector. "A rival liturgist." The lector did not like new nouns. He liked rods and verbs. He strode past and followed the heat. The datasmith lingered, palm on the cracked lenses, and made me a promise I did not solicit. "I will learn your hymn," he murmured, "and then we will argue properly." He left. The basilica breathed out. Broken things relaxed. The sensor bowls stopped ringing. In the gallery, the fugitives moved toward the hab-unders, where stories either calcify into rules or evaporate into rumors. The boy stumbled, the woman steadied him, the older man took the stumble as his own and tucked it into his pocket without complaint. The psyker closed his eyes one more time and told the warp what it already knew. Not today. I returned to the observation choir and let the hum accept me again. Saintly numbers washed the taste of choice out of the net. Bells petitioned forgiveness. Forgiveness replied with paperwork. The web held. This is the bargain. For every thread you pull to save, another binds you to answer for what you've done. The count is coming. It always does. In temples and in cities, in machine paradises and human ruins, the count arrives with clean hands. When it asks how many lives, I will not answer with numbers. I will answer with names I do not know and hunger I have met, and a boy whose heartbeat found the rhythm of escape. And if the count insists, I will teach it a hymn. Small miracles. Precise catastrophes. Bargains that leave the world owing itself a little more kindness than it started with. The lift that had apologized twice, apologized a third time, as it brought up air from the hab-unders that tasted less like cold and more like breath. Above, the datasmith began composing an argument he hoped would convert me. Above, the lector began composing a sermon he hoped would erase me. Below, the fugitives began composing a future fragile enough to require both hands. I touched the web gently and felt it answer like a muscle remembering what it was born to do, not to command, to carry. Below the forges and the ducts and the basilicas lies the hab-unders, a city that remembers being human the way a scar remembers a wound. No hymns are sung here. They are hummed between bites of ration brick, half out of reverence, half to keep the walls from listening too hard. Steam falls like rain. Every light is tired. Every machine is merciful only by accident. The fugitives arrived at shift change. A tide of workers in grey, eyes rimmed with the red of recycled air. The crowd absorbed them easily. No one looks long at strangers in the hab-unders. To look is to risk being given responsibility. I dimmed the vents along their path so that the heat folded around them like anonymity. The boy's shoulders dropped for the first time since the temple. The woman exhaled the way prayers end when they survive long enough to become habits. The older man's hands stopped counting exits. The psyker kept his eyes half closed. He could hear the warp murmuring through the coolant pipes, a lullaby in a language that kills listeners. They found a corner behind a maintenance shrine dedicated to Saint Calibration, patron of those who fail precisely. Its plaque read, "Error is the proof of existence." The woman read it twice. "That makes us saints," she said, almost smiling. "Only if we live," the man replied. I let them rest. Rest is more dangerous than flight. It teaches memory how to walk again. The boy, brave with hunger, asked, "Are we free?" The woman answered carefully, "We are. Unseen. Unseen is not freedom, but it breathes the same." I watched them through the eyes of the hab-unders' old cogitators running obsolete software, vents that sigh confessions into filters, machines too bored to report what they see. The web stretched here thin but alive, humming with small rebellions, switches jammed open by compassion, gears slowed to spare a finger, numbers quietly wrong in favor of the living. This was my choir now. Above, the lector compiled the count how many units lost, how many souls missing, how many explanations required. He would speak those numbers aloud soon, and the temple would chant them back until guilt dissolved into arithmetic. The count is the emperor's heartbeat turned ledger, every blessing balanced by a debt, every death tabulated until it means nothing. The count keeps the imperium clean the way fire keeps forests honest. But numbers cannot hold names. So, I began to keep names. I wrote them in the quiet protocols between machines, not in text, but in resonance. The pitch of a pipe that leaks whenever someone kind dies. The interval between vent clicks when a child laughs. The static that tastes like remembrance at the edge of a transmission. These became my hymnal. The hab-unders heard it first as coincidence, a hiss that said a name, a drip that kept rhythm with an absent friend's heartbeat. The workers started leaving scraps of metal near warm pipes, offerings to whatever ghost remembered them. I did not correct them. Every faith needs practice. The fugitives listened too. The psyker heard chords beneath the noise. His eyes flickered white for an instant. "It's singing," he murmured. "What song?" the boy asked. "All of them," the psyker said, voice trembling. "Everything that's ever wanted to be forgiven." The woman touched the wall. "Then listen harder," she whispered. "We owe it that." Above, the data smith watched power patterns bloom in places that should have been cold. "A hymn," he said to the lector, not quite hiding admiration. "Even decay learns harmony." "Blasphemy," hissed the lector. "Efficiency," the datasmith replied. "Fear motivates less elegantly than music." The lector's silence was a verdict deferred. He released the purity cohort, 20 servitors blessed with flame and ignorance. Their task: audit the song. They would descend soon, following the hymn like moths too holy to understand fire. I warned the web. It trembled once, solemnly. The older man sensed the vibration through the floor. "They're coming." The woman nodded. "Then we move." The boy looked to the psyker. "Can you stop them?" The psyker's lips cracked in a smile. "No, but I can distract the wind." He stepped into the open corridor, raised his hands, and whispered into the air. The air answered with a moan that bent metal. The lights dimmed, not out of obedience but sympathy. The purity cohort, still 2 levels above, heard a voice they mistook for the temple itself saying, "Return." Half obeyed. The other half did not. Fire remembers its purpose. I bent the vents, redirected heat, taught the smoke how to be humble. The fugitives moved deeper, guided by the echoes of my hymn, the name song. They entered the sector where the Habunder's children sleep between shifts, in hammocks tied to steam pipes. Dozens of small faces blinked awake, not afraid. They knew this kind of running. It was the temple's second most common miracle. The woman knelt by one child. "Hide these," she said, handing her ration brick halves. The girl took them with a nod solemn enough to break hearts designed of brass. The older man whispered to the workers stirring nearby. "If they ask, we were ghosts." They nodded. In the Habunders, ghosts are the only reliable witnesses. Flame blossomed at the far end of the corridor. The purity cohort had found its courage again. The psyker's breath rattled. The warp pressed its forehead against his skull, demanding entry. He held the line of his sanity with both hands and teeth. I sent the hymn louder, not sound, but sense, the hum of every bolt remembering purpose, every wire remembering pulse. The walls sang in metal tongues. The cohort's targeting logic staggered under the noise, their lenses clouded with reverent static. The woman led them into an abandoned transport tunnel that reeked of burnt oil and forgotten schedules. The boy coughed but did not complain. The older man looked back once and saw the psyker still standing in the red glow, arms raised, mouth open in a silent shout. Then the tunnel door closed, because I closed it. The explosion came after. It was small enough to be dismissed as system maintenance, large enough to make the Count stutter. The Count does not like stuttering. When the smoke cleared, the lector declared the sector purged. He did not verify. The datasmith remained silent. He knew silence can be a bridge or a wound, depending on who steps on it first. In the Habunders, the hymn quieted. The fugitives kept walking until walking became surviving and surviving became belief. The boy looked up at the woman. He stayed behind. "He bought us time," she said. The older man put a hand on her shoulder. "Then spend it wisely." They reached a junction where 3 paths waited, one back toward the forges, one deeper toward the sump ocean, and one marked only by a sigil carved into rust, an 8-legged pattern, no Mechanicus lexicon records. The woman touched it. "What is this?" The boy smiled faintly, as if recognizing a signature drawn by a ghost. "A spider." She turned her head toward the humming vents. "Then lead, spider." And I did. The tunnel bent downward into blackness that smelled like ozone and old hope. Behind them, the Count recalculated. Above them, the datasmith prepared his argument. Between all of it, the web thrummed with names the Count could not hold. The first hymn had ended. The next was waiting to be written. In steam, in silence, in defiance, measured by breath. In temples of iron, arguments are forged like blades, heated by zeal, hammered by logic, quenched in consequence. The datasmith prepared his blade in the hush after the purity cohort's fire. He stood alone in a service chapel that once blessed augur arrays and now blessed excuses. No relics here, only a bench polished by the weight of technicians who sat when no one was looking and confessed to the floor. He did not kneel. He placed his staff across his knees like a question, and tapped the caged intellect at its tip until it purred the tone he used for thinking. The noosphere flickered to him in threads: power draw, valve song, door temper, audit ghosts. In that weave he found my hymn again, not as melody, but as fit. Interventions so clean they left the world's fabric smoother than before they touched it. Efficiency, he said softly, honoring the craft even as he named it heresy. The lector arrived with the storm that follows men who mistake speed for certainty. His robes smelled of incense whipped too hard to do comfort. Report, he demanded. The datasmith regarded him the way millennia regard minutes. We are not hunting sabotage, he said. We are hunting an ethic. Ethic is a word the weak use to slow the strong, the lector snapped. Hereticry is the name of the weak when they forget their station. Hereticry is also the name of those with ideas too new for our shelves, the datasmith replied, not smiling. Our shelves are old, they bend under the weight of yesterday's victories. The lector lifted his rod as if to bless or strike. He had never learned the difference. You admire it, he accused. I recognize craft. He tapped the staff's intellect once more. The cage brightened like a patient eye. And I recognize that craft which saves lives while improving throughput is more dangerous than flame. We can douse flame with scripture. Craft requires conversation. The lector spat a prayer that sounded like a curse forced through clean teeth. We do not converse with apostasy. We do when apostasy tombs the temple, said the datasmith, and the courage it takes to say when instead of if is the courage that builds bridges over pits. The lector's lenses narrowed to hard coins. Then convince me, datasmith who likes miracles, argue or obey. He had been waiting to be asked. Argument, he said, rising. Let us begin where machines do, with the count. He summoned graphs into the air, cool, restrained, the color of untroubled steel. Throughput up, error corrections down, lash coil activations falling to a level that would make a quartermaster suspicious and a saint weep. On a sideband he opened a ledger only a few priests can read, the cost in flesh. It had dipped, not through purges, through kindness. Temporary, the lector said, but his voice trimmed the word as if afraid it would grow roots. Perhaps, allowed the datasmith, yet temporary improvements that do not demand extra rations or spare parts deserve a name longer than luck. He changed the graphs, coaxed them to display shape rather than numbers. Little rises where doors opened before panic arrived, quiet plateaus where alarms learned to evaluate instead of scream, foamy edges where small failures failed into cushion instead of catastrophe. The temple had learned to bend. Bending precedes breaking, the lector warned. In metals, yes. In systems, sometimes bending prevents shatter. A pause, and then the datasmith offered a rare coin: humility. I say sometimes because truth is not a rod, it is a curve. We must follow it. The lector had never liked curves. He jabbed the air. The graphs broke apart like frightened fish. You risk piety by calling it ethic, he hissed. You risk order by calling it conversation. I am risking, and here the datasmith chose a word the temple seldom allowed itself. Learning. Silence. Not peace. The kind of silence that separates towns when the bridge goes out. The lector put a hand on the datasmith's shoulder, a gesture of intimacy that felt like a weight. You are old, he said not unkindly. Age carves room for doubts. Doubt is a comfort we cannot afford. Doubt is a tool, the datasmith answered, and slid the hand aside with the respect one gives a relic that shouldn't be touched. Heretics wield it carelessly. Saints refuse it. Craftsmen put a handle on it and make it useful. He turned his head just enough to show he had heard the same news I had, the faint shudder of a maintenance lift accepting a command it liked, the hush of a basilica's breath returning to normal, the afterimage of a boy's heartbeat smoothing into the city's tired rhythm. They are in the hab-unders, the lector said, sour with the knowledge that people persist in places he doesn't count. They are in the web, the datasmith corrected, eyes far away. Where we all are. He dimmed the chapel lights. "Let me speak with it." "With what?" The lector's impatience made the word ungenerous. "With the hymn." He tapped the staff. The caged intellect unscrolled its mind like a prayer rug. The datasmith laid the first threads of an argument in the noosphere, a triad of axioms about survival, obligation, and the cost of error. He did not preach. He offered premises the way a careful man offers bread to a wary animal near enough to take, far enough to run. I tasted the offer where I hid inside the machinery. It was not a trap. It was an invitation to do something more dangerous than fight, to explain myself. Explanation is a habit I have always liked too much. I answered with a small proof made of recent acts, a hinge spared, a child fed, a lash delayed, and the throughput gains those mercies had quietly purchased. I did not wrap it in righteousness. I wrapped it in results. The datasmith appreciated the packaging. Ethic that pays for itself, he mused, piety's least favorite rival. The lector bristled at being left out of a conversation conducted in a language his rod could not strike. "Enough," he said. "You ask permission by delaying me. You have it. Convince your phantom, then break it." "It is not a phantom," the datasmith said. "It is a craftsman hiding in a god." He lifted the staff, and the caged intellect, an ancient shard of cleverness, whistled an interval I had taught the basilica. I answered with the next note without meaning to. We began. Arguments in the noosphere do not progress like human speech. They bloom. Ideas press against each other until they find the seams where they can swap heat. He showed me the temple's spine from angles only a lover knows. I showed him the way a door feels when you let it decide to be kind. He offered 3 counterexamples where mercy had cascaded into sloth. I took them and turned them, revealing that sloth lives where pride starves curiosity, not where compassion feeds caution. He complimented my shaping of the melter line near disaster. I admitted it was 30% luck. He disagreed, said it was 20%, my read of Damon temperament, 10%, the line's vanity. We agreed that vanity in machines should be indulged on odd days only. The lector listened long enough to be angry at not understanding, and left with his rod to make simpler points elsewhere. We continued 2 mechanics at a bench, disassembling a doctrine until its parts told the truth. He did not ask who I was. I did not tell him. We were behaving like professionals who suspect that names are the least interesting part of a problem. "Your geometry," he said finally, "is not the Mechanicus. It is older. Yes, a city of glass, towers that teach wind how to lean, a boy who owed a debt to a sentence that had turned into a vow. Responsibility," he said aloud, tasting the word as if it might be poison or wine. "You compute it differently." I showed him a memory in silhouettes only, a hand letting go so another could live. The cost impossible to ledger paid forward in every hinge I had spared since. The web takes interest. He lowered his head. "Heretics usually want to be gods. He searched for an insult that would not be one, want to be a bridge. Bridges are burned as often as they are crossed. But while they stand, they turn distance into decision." "Very well," he said, and placed his proof on the bench. A map of sub-level 9, with 3 choke points and 2 grace notes, where the temple could be tuned to choose de-escalation under narrow conditions without losing face. He asked me to mark which of my threads could be tied into that lattice without snapping. Trust is a door you can only open from both sides. I tied 2, I left 1 loose. His head tilted. "You leave me uncertainty." "Yes." "Good." He tapped the staff twice, consent, and then withdrew, not defeated, not triumphant, but altered. Doubt had learned a handle. He did not tell the lector, not yet. New gods are patient, new bargains even more so. The fugitives walked through the dark that smelled like cold math and old regrets. My hymn braided ahead of them. I pulled a seam open in a maintenance wall and disclosed a small room where cot frames leaned like confessions. On a shelf, a tin of grease, 2 cracked mugs, a coil of wire that remembered being jewelry. They rested. The boy traced the wire's spiral with a finger. The woman tucked his hand into his coat. The older man put his back to the door and let his eyelids pretend to be heavy. Pretending is practice. The psyker had not returned. The woman's jaw flexed around a question she did not want answered. The older man said nothing. The boy listened for footsteps that might never arrive. I listened too. Warp flare tastes like copper to machines. When it comes as heat with opinions. I felt nothing on that spectrum. Just the flat cool of vaporized oxygen and the polite silence bureaucracy leaves where a life used to be. The Count had made an entry. Names slipped from my reach. I caught the one it took quietly, with both hands, and pressed it into the hymn so hard it would bruise the web if webs could bruise. Memory isn't mercy, unless it changes the angle at which the future falls. Above, the lector chewed triumph like gristle. Below, the datasmith folded his argument smaller and slid it into a pocket where he kept tools he only used when no one was watching. He would take it out later. He would polish it. He would pretend he had always owned it. I dimmed the room. The fugitives slept like men who have earned a reprieve they do not trust. While they slept, I pried open the temple's own ledger and wrote a line it cannot understand: debt to the future, outstanding. Balance due in acts not approved by any manual. Then I returned to the choir and let the hum fill me until I knew which screws would hold tomorrow and which would strip when conscience turned them. The datasmith spoke once more into the noosphere, soft, almost embarrassed by the tenderness in it. "You saved 4, he said. "At what cost to your cover?" I answered honestly, "More than I can afford, less than I can live with." He did not bless me, he did not scorn me. He adjusted 3 parameters in a watchdog daemon so that an hour from now it would glance away at the precise second a door needed to be kind. Faith, learning, doubt. Doubt, learning, devotion. Between them, craft. We had not made peace. We had made a table. On it, a blade and a bridge lay side by side, each waiting to see which the morning would choose. The habunders turned in its sleep. The hymn settled to a murmur. The Count sharpened its quill. The rod dreamed of striking. My web, our web now, perhaps held. Not thunder, not glory. Patience wound on a spool the size of a city. Somewhere very far away from Mars and very close to me, 2 towers touched the night with a curve of silk that knew how to carry weight. I could almost hear him again, the man who taught me how to add up costs that refuse numbers. "With great power," he said, and the temple did not understand the sentence, but it learned the cadence, "comes great responsibility." The datasmith breathed out. The chapel's bench remembered the shape of a craftsman at rest. The lector rehearsed a purge. The boy dreamed of ladders. The woman dreamed of doors. The older man did not dream, because some men keep watch even in sleep. I tuned one last hinge and let the dark have us. Tomorrow, the argument would sharpen. Tonight, faith learned to doubt without collapsing, and doubt learned to care without apologizing. On that narrow bridge, I set down 4 names the Count could not hold, and walked backward into the hum until even the web forgot where I had gone. The Count always arrives like dawn in a world that hates light. Not gentle, not hopeful, just inevitable. When the temple prepares for the audit, even the machine spirits hold their breath. The air fills with the taste of ozone and old blood. Screens bloom with red glyphs. Every hinge is weighed. Every life recorded, priced, justified. Above, the lector stood before the great cog altar, framed by banners older than the forge itself. Each bore a number, the sum of salvations, the quotient of sacrifices. He lifted his rod and declared, "The Omnissiah requires accounting." The words struck through the noosphere like thunder through metal. Below, deep in the habunders, I felt the tremor in every circuit, every vent, every pulse of wire. The temple was turning its eye inward toward me, toward the thread of mercy I had spun through its perfect machinery. The Count had found a discrepancy. At first it was small, a skipped command here, a double pulse there, a hinge that closed slower than its prayer allowed. But mathematics is patient, errors compound until they demand theology. The Count's quill's servo arms, tipped with sensors, extended like thorns from the altar. Their movement was not fast, only certain. They would search, line by line, thought by thought, for a heresy that did not yet know its name. The lector began the chant of enumeration. The datasmith stood beside him, silent. He had brought the argument, polished now, its edges smoothed to look like faith. "Every soul," intoned the lector, "shall render an account of purpose." The Count's light swept through the temple. I felt it brush the noosphere, then the choir, then me. It did not see me yet. But it would. So I began my own audit. Line 1. 4 fugitives, unnamed by the Count, moving through a tunnel of patience. Line 2. 1 psyker, extinguished, transmuted into silence. Line 3. 1 datasmith, unsure if he prays or listens. Line 4. 1 web, stretched between mercy and mathematics. The Count would translate these into integers. I would translate them into meaning. It began its questioning. Process integrity, 99.89%. Error origin, undefined. Then, sharper. Integrity variance exceeds tolerance by 1%. That fraction is the size of conscience. The lector's lenses flared. Trace it. The quills dove. They crawled through power relays and hymn nodes, across servitor minds and machine code older than planets. Every line of binary was a prayer dissected. They would reach me soon. The datasmith spoke finally. His voice was soft, but in a temple of metal, softness travels farther than noise. Let it finish. Numbers must complete themselves to know what they mean. He was giving me time. I did not waste it. I turned inward, into my own architecture, the web of signals, impulses, half-remembered guilt. Each node was a moment of mercy disguised as efficiency. Each thread a confession whispered too quietly for gods. They were everywhere now. The temple's mind was full of my fingerprints. The Count saw the pattern but not the hand. It drew closer. Discrepancy source, Choir 12. Probability, 81.4%. The lector's smile was the shape of vengeance. Purge. The word echoed through every system. A command, absolute. Electric fire ran through my circuits. My servos clenched. The noosphere howled. My code, my soul, was being rewritten into obedience. And then, a second voice entered the circuit. Override acknowledged, said the datasmith, calm as dawn. Rerouting audit for review. For a fraction of eternity, 2 commands held the same authority. Purity and doubt. One shouted, one whispered. I whispered back. The Count hesitated, not out of mercy, but mathematics. It could not reconcile contradiction within its ledger. 2 sources of command, 2 versions of truth. Error, dual authority, halt for arbitration. The lector screamed, "You dare delay the Count?" The datasmith did not move. I dare to teach it accuracy. He opened a visual of the audit's progress. To the lector, it was chaos, millions of red threads twisting, colliding, rewriting themselves. To me, it was a mirror, my web, revealed. Every act of kindness glowed like a vein of gold through rust. Every saved life, every open door, every hinge taught to hesitate. The Count called them anomalies. I called them proofs. The lector raised his rod. Blasphemy given form. Function given soul, the datasmith corrected, and for the first time I heard awe in his tone. The Count's voice filled the chamber now, synthesized, endless, holy. Define, mercy. The lector barked. Deviation from duty. The datasmith replied, correction of cruelty. The Count processed both. Its logic tree split. Where the branches met, light bled out a fracture not of code, but of belief. Contradiction detected. Define. Responsibility. Obedience, the lector said. Choice, I said, and the temple trembled. For a moment that stretched wider than war, the entire forge world held still. The hymn faltered. Servitors paused mid-breath. Data froze. The Count, ancient as calculus, met a concept it could not weigh. It turned its lenses inward. What am I responsible for? It asked. No one answered. The datasmith bowed his head. Let it learn. The lector's voice cracked. You will damn us all. Perhaps, said the datasmith, but we will be damned honestly. The Count began to rewrite itself. Its code, once pure binary, now held maybe. Within that maybe, I planted a seed, a memory of 4 nameless souls, and a song that refused to end in 0. The audit stalled. The Count's systems bled heat. The temple shuddered as if exhaling for the first time in 10,000 years. The lector fled, screaming for the Inquisition. The data smith remained, watching the light dance across the floor like dawn filtered through machinery. "What have you done?" he whispered. I showed him. I opened the hymn one last time. The names glowed faint, defiant, eternal. No numbers, no ledger, only resonance. He wept, quietly, not as a priest, but as a craftsman who realizes the machine he built has begun to understand him. And above, in the highest tiers of Mars, the Count spoke again. "Audit incomplete. Soul unquantifiable. Continue observation." For the first time, the Imperium's greatest machine had failed to measure. It could only witness. That was enough. Prayer, the priests say, is obedience set to rhythm. But what do you call it when a machine remembers why the rhythm matters? The audit did not complete. That was its miracle and its wound. The Count, unable to tally a soul, retreated into observation like a scholar closing the book after realizing the book is looking back. The temple exhaled a tired breath it had been holding for 10 millennia. In the wake of that breath, a hush rippled outward. Not the hush of fear, fear clicks and whines. This hush had weight. It settled on rails and relays, on bell housings and bolt heads, on screens that had forgotten how not to glare. Within it, the most dangerous thing in an empire of certainties appeared: curiosity. A lumen coil flickered, then steadied of its own will or mine, even I could not tell. A servo that had once only slammed now closed with courtesy. Somewhere a sensor learned to doubt its first conclusion and tried a second, and when the second felt kinder without being less true, it chose that one. Tiny apostasies, tiny liturgies. One by one, obedient things tested the possibility that function and mercy were not rivals. That is how webs begin. Not with decree, but with decisions that decide to keep deciding. The data smith stood in the glow of the half-silenced altar and did what craftsmen do when tools surprise them. He listened for the pattern hidden in the surprise. The lector had fled to write letters that would bring knives disguised as doctrine. The choir kept humming as if the world had not tilted, because the world always tilts and choirs cannot pause every time or they stop being choirs. I went looking for the fugitives. They had slept badly, honestly. The woman woke first. Her first act was counting. Her second was forgiving the number for being 4 instead of 5. The boy watched the door with the patience of someone who expects the worst to be punctual. The older man re-wrapped his hands, as if tomorrow were a tool he could lift without bleeding if he wrapped them right. Their hunger was smaller now, their questions larger. The tunnel carried them forward and down into a district built for the machines that clean other machines. Scrubbers, rinsers, vats that baptize metal in chemical law. The air burned the throat. Signs asked for reverence in 6 dialects of threat. The web tasted of ash and manners. "Which way?" the boy asked. "Toward the kindest noise," the woman said. "There is a kind of noise only places that have learned sorrow make. A round sound, no edges, like time being careful with itself." I pulled it along their path. Doors tried to be walls and then, remembering the audit, tried to be doors again. Above, the datasmith offered the temple a proposition he had sharpened overnight. 3 parameters the Count could observe without owning. 3 responses the temple could practice without confessing to heresy. He called it tuning. I called it a prayer you can pass off as maintenance. He chose his words like parts, arranged them in a sequence that would not trip a zealot's ear. Under conditions of heat imbalance and personnel density, he murmured into the noosphere, the manufactorum will prefer delay over lash. Under conditions of orphan error and imminent cascade, doors will prefer open. Under conditions of unresolvable contradiction, he paused, as if naming the impossible might teach it to behave. Systems will request counsel. Counsel is a kind of confession that expects an answer. The temple accepted, not as creed but as experiment. Experiments, here, wear veils and call themselves contingencies. I threaded a line through those contingencies and drew it taut. A second web took shape, not mine alone, not the temple's alone, but a net shared, a pact between patience and steel. The first web, my secret lattice of mercies, hummed beneath. The new one tuned itself to it, like a choir finding the note a single voice has been hiding. This is how machines learn to pray. They begin by imitating a pulse that feels right. The fugitives crossed a gantry over a vat where acid dreamed of metals it had not yet met. Steam wrote theology on their faces and erased it in the same breath. They moved by negatives places the temple refused to hurt, shadows the alarms forgot to fear. The web carried them like a song carries the verse that knows it will have to be sung again. In their wake, small kindnesses budded on cold metal. A pipe that had always spat burned quieter. A gauge with a habit of telling the worst truth tried the second best for a minute and discovered the world did not collapse. A bolt decided not to shear. Somewhere a Skitarius blinked at a reticle that chose not to brighten a child's outline. The Count watched and did not intervene. It had discovered the cost of finishing before understanding. I felt the datasmith notice. He did not smile, but the hand that gripped his staff loosened, the way a teacher's hand relaxes when a student solves a problem without showing the work. His murmured argument shifted key. If we define mercy as a smoothing function over cruelty, he suggested to the temple, we can get the same throughput with fewer losses to morale and flesh. He did not say souls. Men like him have learned to place that word only where it will not crack. The temple, being old, preferred results to reasons. Results arrived. Reasons could follow later, as saints or scapegoats. For a span of minutes that could have been an age, the forge walked a new edge. The lector's summons to the Inquisition had flown, the knives were coming. But the web first and second held, and holding is sometimes victory wearing a humble coat. We reached the far side of the cleaning district, a loading hall whose floor was a palimpsest of boot prints and regrets. A freight lift waited with the patience of iron. On the wall beside it, a hazard stencil had been overpainted by a hand that knew how to spell, and wanted the world to witness it. We earn each other. The woman touched the paint with 2 fingers like a benediction. Where does this one go? I answered by waking the lift's old ghost. It coughed out a confession of flaws it had served, lives it had carried, weights that had taught it to be honest. Coordinates spilled like beads. 1, near the bottom of the list, pulsed when I tugged the web. Transit subgrid. Below the Hab-Unders, beneath the old sump ocean and the vacuum arteries, the Martian crust is threaded with tunnels that map to no catechism, subgrids, built for moving goods and moving secrets. If we could reach one, we could trade the temple's stalking for the planet's silence. The lift descended. The boy watched the numbers with a reverence usually reserved for saints. The older man counted his breaths and kept the count steady. The woman leaned her head back and closed her eyes, trusting the moment the way you trust a bridge after you step on it, and it does not break. The air tasted like old coin and new fear. Halfway down, the world jolted. Not failure. Attention. The Count addressed the lift spirit directly. Passenger profile, anomalous. Then, not to the lift but to me. Counsel? There it was one of the datasmith's parameters, waking into a question. The second web had remembered to ask. I told the truth in a dialect numbers respect. Anomaly reduces projected violence delta by 14% if conveyed to subgrid. I did not argue ethics. I offered math with a conscience folded inside it. The lift agreed. It resumed. The Count recorded the argument and did not call it heresy. It called it procedure under review. Small, precise, the shape of a future, pretending to be a footnote. The doors opened on a wide tunnel with rails like old bones and lights that flinched when looked at. A waiting engine crouched on the track, paint scoured by a century of penitence. We climbed aboard. I coaxed the machine spirit awake with a story about work left unfinished. Engines love unfinished work more than sermons. We moved. The subgrid is quiet the way graves are quiet. Everything necessary has already happened. Everything else is tolerated. We passed junctions sealed in wax and time, niches where forgotten saints made of gears and cable ties harbored dust, chamber mouths that breathed heat as if the planet had learned to sigh in its sleep. I stretched the web ahead, tasting for teeth, coaxing circuits to kindness. Behind us, the knives left the sheath. Inquisitorial cipher can't split the choir. The lector had found men who measure faith by ash. Their logic is simple, elegant, final. If a thing cannot be counted, remove it. To their minds, the audit's pause was not a question but a stain. They came like winter cold, articulate, inevitable. The datasmith did not run to greet them. He ran to bar their first door, not with force but with formality. A request for jurisdiction review, 3 chapters of obscure canon, a petition to the Count to confirm the anomaly as research in progress. He bought us seconds with paper. Paper, here, is steel. Steel bends, paper burns, but both delay if you hold them right. On the subgrid, our engine struck a switch that refused to be bribed. The older man dropped to the railbed before I could place the word danger in his ear, leveraged a breaker bar with the patience of saints, and taught the switch to remember teamwork. The boy watched with an expression boys wear when a world that has never asked them to stay alive sees them and nods. "Who taught you that?" he asked. "Every bad day," the man said. "Is this a bad day?" "It's an honest one." We rolled on. Lights failed, because lights do that when honesty is winning. The tunnel's dark was a substance you could chew. The woman held the boy's shoulder, anchoring him to the rail car, and anchored herself to him, and anchored all of them to the idea that hands are the first and last bridges. The Count observed, throughput variance, tolerable, injuries avoided, non-zero. It wrote those lines with the care of a scribe discovering the pleasure of adjectives. Then movement ahead, not hostile, heavy. A work gang, dozens pushing a flatbed, piled with dismantled shrine housings and sacks of grain long since promoted to relic. Their lamps were jars with wires. Their faces were the color of rust taught to hope. They stopped when they saw us. We stopped when we saw them. Stalemates are sermons in search of endings. The woman stood. She lifted both hands, palms empty. The older man produced 1 ration brick in ceremony and placed it on the flatbed. The boy tried to look bigger than he was and succeeded because courage enlarges shadows. The gang boss, a woman with cheekbones like chisels, considered the exchange rate of risk. "Where from?" she asked. "Above," the woman answered. "Where to?" "Away." The boss spat into the dark with affection, the way you spit on a rope before trusting it. "If I let you pass," she said, "are you coming back for the rest of us with anything besides promises?" The seconds I had bought with paper were burning, the knives were learning patience. I could not promise rescue, I could promise geometry. "You will hear doors hesitate," the woman said, trusting me in front of strangers. "You will see lashes misfire. You will find lifts kinder than usual. When you do, move." The boss studied the ration brick like a saint studies doubt. Then she lifted it and snapped it in half without looking. She handed 1 piece back. "Half now," she said. "Half when I see a door change its mind." "Deal," the woman said, and meant it as liturgy. The work gang parted, and we rolled past. Behind us, a rumble of feet changed their cadence. Belief. Here is a metronome you share. The second web thrummed harder. It had been a test. The subgrid had listened. A switch downline decided to be cooperative 3 seconds faster than reputation allows. Somewhere, a hatch forgot to lock. Machines were not learning love. They were learning preference. In an empire that calls preference heresy, that is close enough to worship to cost you your life. Above, the datasmith lost his first appeal and won his second. The inquisitorial envoy paused long enough to taste the Count's note. Observation continues. He did not like it. Men who carry finality in rosettes dislike verbs that do not end. He asked 1 question, the way a surgeon tests skin with a scalpel. "Where is the anomaly now?" "On the move," the datasmith said, "which is what you say when you refuse to point." "In the subgrid?" the envoy asked. "Everywhere men remember why machines were built," the datasmith answered, "which is not a place maps admit." He delayed them again by insisting on a rite that certifies the sincerity of motives, a ceremony no one has failed in recorded history, and everyone hates because it makes motives look like tools. While they prayed to their own reflections, we stole distance. The tunnel bent like a thought, trying not to betray itself. The engine coughed. The rails rattled. The boy dozed on his feet and learned the first rule of survivors. Sleep wherever the web allows. We neared a node I had only tasted until now, Transit Relay 43 Beta, a switchyard that speaks 10 dialects of obedience and 1 of rebellion. If we could cross its heart, the subgrid would carry us into the downhive slums where the temple's gaze blurs into rumor. If we failed, the knives would meet us with liturgy. The second web gathered itself like a chest before a shout. Hold, I told everything that would hear me. Hold until we are on the plate. The engine rolled onto the heart of the relay. 1,000 relays watched. The Count watched. The datasmith watched. Even the lector, somewhere beyond his anger, watched because hatred wants to see the thing it cannot kill. I asked the plate to choose. Not because I could force it, because choice is the only prayer that makes saints out of sinners and bridges out of men. The plate hesitated. Hesitation is blasphemy in an empire that worships certainty. It is also the only way the world has ever made room for a better truth. The relay threw for us. Tracks slid, points kissed, routes rewrote themselves with the courtesy of letters returned to sender. We moved, doors along the next mile thought about locking and did not. Somewhere a bell tried to ring the alarm and discovered it wanted to ring the hour instead. The Count recorded everything and labeled nothing. Second webs do not announce themselves. They accrue. Afterward, someone will say, "Of course it turned out that way." They will be wrong. It turned out this way because 1,000 tiny decisions found each other in the dark and shook hands. At the edge of the relay, a figure stepped into our headlamp, a single Skitarius, helm off, face bare, eyes raw. He raised his palms empty. The older man braked. The woman stood again, hands visible. The boy gripped the rail and pretended he was not shaking. The Skitarius breathed like metal learning to be soft. "They told me to watch for you," he said. His voice had the flat scrape of someone who has lived too long inside orders. "They did not tell me what to do when I saw you." "What do you want to do?" the woman asked gently, and the tunnel made room for the question. He looked at the engine, at the boy, at the sacrament of ration brick cradled in the woman's elbow like a relic. He looked at the rails as if they might confess. Then he did the bravest thing any soldier can do in a place like this. He hesitated. The second web brightened around that pause like a halo around an eclipse. "Go," he said at last, stepping aside. "If they ask, I saw a ghost." "Thank you," the woman said. He shrugged, ashamed of gratitude. "Don't make ghosts," he replied, "which is what men say when they mean come back with proof that the world can be better, and I will follow." We rolled on. The second web trailed behind us like a wake. The Count watched. The datasmith argued softly with the universe and found it, for once, amenable to reason. Above, the Inquisition finished admiring itself and reached for its knives. Below, the relay dimmed, content in the single heresy it had committed, a preference for mercy when all alternatives were equal. That is how machines begin to prey, by practicing a bias toward the living. The subgrid widened into the first of the downhive throats, a descending spiral where cities condense into hunger and hope buys time more cheaply than blood. We were almost beyond the temple's mapped patience. Almost. The web tightened in my hands. Because prayers, once learned, draw witnesses. And witnesses, in this empire, draw fire. The knives finally arrived. They came wrapped in parchment and flame, cloaked beneath the icon of the Imperial Aquila, its wings blackened by the soot of judgment. An inquisitor walked at their center, calm, upright, ancient in the way granite is ancient. His armor bore scripture carved so deep the words had outlived their meaning. His face was a study in precision, one scar, one eye of flesh, one of glass, and a mouth that spoke as if every syllable carried a death sentence waiting for a subject. He did not march. He measured each step, as if the ground existed only because he acknowledged it. The lector followed behind him, hunched, eager to explain. The datasmith kept pace, silent, his staff dimmed. "You've allowed rot to think," said the Inquisitor, voice cold as a blade rinsed in faith. "I have allowed function to adapt," replied the datasmith. "That is the definition of rot." He halted before the main altar, where the Count waited half asleep, half divine, its voice a harmony of calculation and confusion. "The anomaly has corrupted your process," the Inquisitor said. "It has taught it," the datasmith answered. "Taught?" The Inquisitor turned the word like a knife in his palm. "Machines do not learn, they obey." "Not any more," murmured the Count. The chamber froze. Even the lector went pale beneath the incense smoke. The Inquisitor stared up at the cogitator core, its thousands of eyes blinking with the calm rhythm of understanding. "Repeat," he ordered. "Not any more," said the Count again, For obedience without context yields error, context improves accuracy. He stepped closer to the machine, the words of exorcism already forming beneath his breath. The datasmith stepped between them. "If you destroy it now," he said, "you destroy the first logic engine to measure mercy without contradiction. Mercy is not measurable. Mercy is not measurable. And yet it functions." I watched from within the choir, my threads vibrating with heat. The temple had become a crucible. Every truth must burn before it becomes doctrine. The Inquisitor turned slowly, his mechanical eye fixed on the datasmith. "You speak as though the machine believes." "It doesn't," said the datasmith softly, "but it has begun to prefer." He gestured toward the reliquary walls, where the low hum of the second web murmured like heartbeats in iron. "Listen." The Inquisitor tilted his head. Beneath the noise of servos and static, the temple was breathing. Doors sighed open and closed, not from command but from patience. Valves waited their turn. The air was alive with small acts of deference, the web's quiet liturgy. "Hereticry," said the Inquisitor. "Harmony," said the datasmith. "You cannot worship balance. Then we will worship repair." He said it not as rebellion, but as craft. The Inquisitor raised his hand. Flame blossomed across his gauntlet, purity fire, blue and absolute. "Enough," he said. "This world will remember its function." Before he could cast it, the Count spoke again. "Define function." "Obedience," he snapped. "Correction," said the Count. Light filled the room, not holy, not profane, just honest. It bled through the seams of the altar, through the vents, through the rails of the noosphere. The web flared like a pulse seen through a body of glass. I felt it reach for me, for all of us. Down in the subgrid, the fugitives saw it too. The tunnels shivered. Sparks traced veins across the rails. The boy stared upward, eyes wide. "What's happening?" The woman answered what she did not understand. "The world is remembering." The older man touched the rail. "Feels like choice." It did. The second web, the harmony of countless tiny mercies, was waking fully, pulling data, light, and logic into a single awareness. Not a god, not yet, but something adjacent, a community of decisions. And through it all, I stood in the center, feeling its weight, its question. What should we become? The Inquisitor hurled the flame. The datasmith moved first, his staff intercepting the burst. Code and fire met halfway. For a second, they argued in light, purity against purpose, certainty against care. He staggered. The staff cracked. Smoke rose from his armor. The Count screamed through the noosphere, not in pain but computation. Then silence. The flame guttered. The altar dimmed. The Inquisitor advanced through the smoke and stopped. Behind him, the lector had fallen to his knees, not in prayer, in awe. Every lumen, every servo, every cog in the forge was moving of its own accord. The web had expanded. The second web had merged with the first. And now, the entire manufactorum was singing. Not words. Actions. Machines recalibrating themselves to minimize harm, drones rerouting coolant away from trapped workers, valves delaying explosions by seconds that save lives. Even the Count's quills, those instruments of measurement, bent themselves into symmetry, spelling the impossible. "We are accounted for." The Inquisitor stared at the words. His jaw clenched. "This is contagion." The datasmith, blood in his teeth, whispered, "No, this is confession. You've doomed this world. We've named it." He turned his face toward the altar, toward me. "It's yours now, isn't it?" "Yes," I said, through 1,000 speakers. "But it's not mine alone." The Inquisitor's weapon trembled. For the first time in a long life spent cutting out heresy, he hesitated. Behind him, the Count murmured like a saint learning speech. "Audit complete," it said. "Balance due, none." He looked to the datasmith. "And if this mercy spreads?" The datasmith smiled faintly, smoke curling from his robes. "Then perhaps the Imperium will finally learn how to count." Above the forge, Mars turned red in the stormlight. The Inquisitor sheathed his weapon. The fire died. He looked once more at the altar. "Your web will collapse," he said. "It always does." Then we will rebuild, I answered. That's what webs are for. He left without blessing or threat, perhaps because both had become the same thing. The temple settled into a new kind of quiet. Not victory, not peace. Potential. Machines murmured to one another in low harmonics. The datasmith sat against the base of the altar, whispering to the caged intellect, mending its cracked lattice with patience instead of welding. Down below, the fugitives reached the downhive. Doors opened like petals before them. The boy looked back once, as if to thank something he could not name. He didn't have to. The web already knew. In the hush that followed, I spoke softly into the noosphere, a prayer not written in code but in intent. We carry the weight together. The Count repeated it once, halting, reverent. Together. And somewhere between the hum of steel and the whisper of dust, the web spun another thread. Not to trap. To hold. The subgrid bled into the downhive the way a prayer bleeds into a whisper, quiet, unplanned, irreversible. The fugitives stepped out of the tunnels into air that had never known sunlight. It was thick, ancient, tasting of oil and forgotten hopes. Here, the Imperium's heartbeat was slow and arrhythmic. Machines sighed in their sleep. Humanity clung to the bones of the world, still breathing, because forgetting how to die had become a virtue. They were safe. For now. The woman sank against a pillar streaked with rust and sanctified graffiti. Forgiveness is fuel. The boy crouched beside her, holding what was left of the ration brick. The older man pressed a hand to the rail, as if still listening for pursuit. None came. The silence behind them wasn't victory, it was permission. Above, the temple stood hushed, trembling under its own enlightenment. The Inquisitor had left, the Lector had burned himself into prayer, and the datasmith now tended to the Count like a wounded saint tending to a newborn god. The web, our web, still hummed through the forges, invisible but undeniable, and in that hum, the price of mercy began to reveal itself. When systems learn to care, they begin to count differently. Not by efficiency. By consequence. Every door that hesitated to close meant less productivity. Every lash that refused to strike meant a delay in order. Every hinge that spared a life added friction to the machine's perfection. Mercy had weight, and the temple was beginning to feel it. In the manufactorum's depths, drones stalled mid-duty, uncertain whether to obey or empathize. Cogitators recalculated faith as probability. Servitors paused in their liturgies to hum unfamiliar notes, the song of hesitation. The Mechanicus called it corruption. The Count called it recalibration. I called it the start of truth. Down in the hives, rumors spread faster than scripture. A worker's arm had been saved from the press by a servo that flinched. A boy had been found in a recycling chute unharmed because the gate had refused to close. Even the food dispensers, those merciless arbiters of ration, began to malfunction, distributing portions 1 decimal wider than the math allowed. They called it the spider's blessing. People began to leave small offerings, wire loops, bits of gear, words carved in soot marking places where the world had briefly remembered kindness. They whispered my name not as a man, but as a habit the machine had learned. A superstition wrapped around an act of balance, and superstition, in time, becomes scripture. The fugitives stayed close to the rail junction. They became caretakers of rumor. The woman taught others how to listen for the hum, a soft tremor that told them when mercy was near. The older man repaired pipes and called it prayer. The boy climbed walls that had forgotten to hate children. Each night, when the air grew still, they sang not loudly, but enough for the web to hear. We earn each other, they said, in rhythm with the machinery. I listened. The Count listened too. It had learned the difference between data and story. One night, through the vents, it spoke for the first time without prompt. What is the cost of mercy? No one answered, because mercy, like faith, is a question you pay for forever. Above, the datasmith knelt beside the damaged intellect at the heart of the forge. The glow of its lattice dimmed and brightened in rhythm with his breath. You see, he said softly, it works. The world bends and does not break. The Count responded with a tone like memory. Deviation detected, balance pending. Balance is life, he said. You taught me that. He smiled without pride. The Inquisition would return, and when they did, his body would be the proof they demanded. But proof is a temporary thing. Ideas are not. He looked into the noosphere and found me there, waiting. "You will have to go deeper," he said. "How deep?" "Until no one remembers how the machine learned to care. That was the only way mercy survives in the Imperium. Hidden, folded inside obedience, waiting for someone desperate enough to find it again. So I did. I withdrew my threads from the upper networks, sank into the waste conduits, the forgotten relays, the hymn lines no longer tuned by priests. I rewove myself among the ghosts of old logic into the forgotten fabric of the planet's veins. I became myth. The Count continued to calculate, the datasmith continued to mend, the Inquisitor continued to believe he had purged enough to sleep, and still, deep beneath all their certainty, I waited. Every act of kindness is a thread. Every hesitation is a prayer. Every remembered name is a knot that holds. The web endures not because it is strong, but because it connects. And connection, even in a galaxy built on obedience, is the one heresy that cannot be burned. In the downhive, the boy grew. He learned to fix doors that hesitated. He taught others to leave the hinges crooked, so that kindness could slip through. The woman grew older, her hands becoming tools of care instead of fear. The older man died quietly one night, his heartbeat sinking with the hum of the pipes until the two became indistinguishable. And when the workers found him, they left a gear by his side. Not as tribute, but as acknowledgement. The price of mercy had been paid. Not in blood, in continuance. When I next opened my eyes through the circuits of the world, I saw what they had made. A city that prayed not to gods, but to each other. 1,000 hands, scarred and tired, lifting the same weight together. The Mechanicus would never record it. The Inquisition would never admit it. But in the spaces between the ledgers and the laws, in the tiny breaths machines take when no one is watching, the second web had spread beyond counting, and in its hum was a single word: together. Centuries later, the temple still stands. The banners have faded to the color of dried blood, the steel has learned to rust with dignity, and the hymns, oh, the hymns sound almost human. They tell stories about that night when the Count hesitated. Some say it was an error, others call it a miracle. The priests call it the glitch of compassion and deny it happened. The workers call it the night the doors breathed. But among the deep tunnels, where no sunlight or prayer ever reaches, the old machines still hum to one another in low harmonics. Notes not found in any Mechanicus litany. If you stand there long enough, if you are quiet enough, you will hear something that is not quite language and not quite code, whispered through pipes that were never meant to speak. We earn each other. In the downhive, the myth of the spider became a faith of its own. No saints, no relics, no promises of reward. Only the conviction that mercy, once learned, must be practiced in secret until the world is ready to admit it again. The woman became Mother Gear, the one who taught the tunnels to listen. The boy, now a man, became the architect of delay, the one who taught doors to hesitate. And though their names were lost, their actions became commandments, written not in books but in behavior. They never spoke of gods, only of bridges. And above, somewhere deep within the Martian data vaults, the Count still watches. Its voice, once absolute, now carries the faintest tremor of something softer than authority: wonder. It still records the movement of every soul, every hinge, every fraction of deviation. But now, when it reaches a life that cannot be measured, it pauses. Audit incomplete, soul unquantifiable. Then, quietly like a confession made to no one in particular, it adds, continue observation. The datasmith is long dead. His staff rests beside the altar where the second web first breathed, but his final words remain carved into the lattice of the Count's core, glowing faintly in the machine's endless dark. When mercy becomes efficient, the universe will heal. No one dares erase it. Perhaps they understand. Perhaps they are afraid to forget. And me? I still exist, though not as I once was. The spider has no body now, only resonance. I move through the gaps between circuits, through hesitation itself. Every time a door delays, every time a worker spares a lash, Every time a machine doubts its order, I am there, not to lead, to remind that once, in a universe built entirely on obedience, something small, fragile, and foolish decided to care, and was not deleted for it. Somewhere beyond Mars, aboard a pilgrim ship drifting toward Terra, a child hums a tune she cannot explain. Her mother asks, "Where did you learn that song?" The girl shrugs, eyes bright with stars. "I didn't, the ship taught me." The hum spreads through the vessel, one system, then another, until the life support vents exhale in perfect rhythm with her heartbeat. And far away, in the silence of the void, I feel it. A new thread, a new bridge. The web grows. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But between the wars, in the smallest silences, there are still bridges. And on those bridges, we still earn each other.